Well, welcome everyone to this episode of Stories for Healing. I want to welcome you all now. We find ourselves in 2021 in the next year before us. This has been going on since the end of October, still going strong. And I want to encourage you to continue to watch with no end in sight for these stories. Storytellers are still coming from around the world to tell stories of healing and transformation and growth. Um, and be sure you share them on YouTube and Facebook. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome back Fred Mindlin, who's a storyteller from what we call the West Coast. So, Fred, please tell us a story.
Well, I usually tell stories with string, and even though I'm not using string, I still want to acknowledge, as I always try to do, the Ohlone Amamutsun Band, on whose land I am now in Watsonville near the coast of California. And this is a different story. It's not a story that I wrote or thought of, but discovered actually as a small greeting card story booklet that was sold sometime. I got it in the early 80s. It was published in 1982 by Green Tiger Press in La Jolla, California. And the author of the story is a woman named Mary Hackman. And I've looked for her on the web. I tried to track down the publisher. They were bought by another company in Seattle and said that they didn't know how to reach her either. And so they felt like it was okay for me to go ahead and tell this story. It's been one of my favorite stories that I have read aloud many, many times to all of my children and many others. But it's a story that I'm now telling without a text for the first time. So I'll begin with a little music just to set this faraway mood. The story is called The Old Woman of Torah. When Tsar ruled over the kingdom of Torah, he called his builders to him one day and said, "Build me a palace that will last for 1,000 years." And so the builders set to work, and they raised a great palace. The rafters and lintels were hewn out of oak. It took many years, but finally it was finished. And then soon after, a great fire raged through the land, and there was nothing left of the palace but some charred embers. Tsar called his builders again and said, "Build me a palace that will last for 1,000 years." And the builders set to work again, raising great stone ceilings, vaulted ceilings. It took many more years to finish that palace, and soon after an earthquake came and shook the land, and soon there was nothing but a pile of rubble. There came an old woman to the palace who asked admittance and said to the assembled courtiers, "Sire, I ask your leave to build you a palace that will last for 1,000 years." And Tsar said to her, "How will you build such a palace?" And she answered, I will build it out of what floats on the wind and gives to everything its shape and form. And Tsar turned to his counselors and said, Who is this woman who speaks in riddles? And one of them said, Her name is Marin, and she is the daughter of Koar. Koar was said to have great power of words. It is said that she could raise a forest out of the desert. Tsar said to the woman, How can you raise a palace? And Marin began speaking very softly, and her words burbled like water. And soon there was a fountain bubbling in the courtyard. And Tsar was amazed and said to Marin, Yes, you may build me a palace. And she set to work, speaking softly. First, her words were azure and crimson, and these became the walls of the palace. And then there were other words that were opal and sapphire, and those were the lintels and ceilings. And finally, some words were as crystal, and these became the windows. So the palace was finished, and Tsar was very pleased. How will this palace last for 1,000 years? She said to Marin. And Marin said, The palace will last, sire, as long as anyone remembers the words. And so she taught the words out of which the palace was built to Tsar, and he taught those words to his children, and they taught them to their children. And some say that that palace still exists, because even when there came, shortly after it was finished, a great fire, it burned through the land, but the palace remained. The earth again shook, but the palace did not fall. And so all of the children of Tsar remembered the words. And it is said by some that the fountain still burbles in the courtyard outside the palace.
Oh, Fred, what a beautiful story. I,
Yes, I've
I
always loved that story as a budding storyteller. It was such an inspiration.
sure. And do you know the names and all? Is that coming from a particular culture that you know of, or these are all inventions of the author?
I believe it is a totally invented story.
Okay. Yeah.
But as I said, I've researched the
Yeah.
author,
Yeah.
contacted the publisher, and no one has any information. There are beautiful illustrations that go with the little booklet
Uh-huh.
the story was published. And I actually have a version up on YouTube of me reading the story with the images from the
Yeah.
book in the background.
Wow. Because there is something um, wonderful about the strangeness of the names,
Yes.
and it's clearly a very well crafted story in that regard to bring that.
It feels like one of those stories of sort of like an Arthurian legend, but
Yeah,
from some other mythical realm.
it absolutely has that flavor. It absolutely has that flavor. And would you say just a little bit about what you find healing in that story? Because I think it has a lot of healing power, but how does it affect you?
It is the power of the word as somehow a source of strength and comfort. And those words don't necessarily feel like a physical thing, and yet in the story they actually create the
Yeah,
physical world. And that is a way in which I feel like we can use words, and that's part of what this whole enterprise of telling stories for healing is about.
yes,
Healing
absolutely.
is a physical thing that happens in the body, and yet the words are ephemeral and ethereal, and yet they have this power.
And they certainly do. And to me, the other piece of it, and I absolutely agree. The other piece is that the generations of retelling
Yes.
is something that you do because you have the expectation that there will be another generation to follow. So there's hope in there as well.
Yes,
Wonderful.
it reminds me of the Native American expression, all my relations.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. And so many stories that depend on that, as the retelling is the healing in itself. It's beautiful. Well, okay. I'd like to thank all of you for stopping by today for this wonderful story. Um, and I also wanted you to appreciate, the work that goes into figuring out a story, as Fred described, the effort he put into trying to find the author and get permission. It's not just to get permission, although that is certainly important, but also to understand some of the deeper thoughts behind the stories, and that's the craft of storytelling.
Yes,
Um,
and acknowledging authorship when it's known and speaking it up, and perhaps one day Martha will get in touch
wouldn't
and
that be
say,
wonderful?
"Oh,
Through the power of story. So again, we're on Facebook Live, we're on YouTube. Look for us there. Share stories and share not only the recorded stories, but share stories with each other. Keep those chains alive and vibrant, and that's how we'll end up healing each other.